What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all doing well. And today we're going to be talking about a film that's getting all kinds of reactions online before the film is even officially released, and is the latest Disney live-action remake of their very first animated film, and that film is called Snow White. Directed by Marc Webb and written by Aaron Cressida Wilson, this film stars people like Rachel Zegler, Gal Gadot, Andrew Burnap, Andrew Barth Feldman, and many more. And before we get too far into this video, if you guys are a fan of early reviews like this, as well as up-to-date reviews, retrospective reviews, live streams, and the occasional vlog, then you're in the right place, and I'd like to ask you to consider subscribing. But if you're a returning viewer, well, thanks so much for coming back. I appreciate it very, very much. And today we're going to be talking about the latest Disney live-action remake of Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, this time around simply titled Snow White. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about a lot of the backlash before we even get into this review. This film, before even releasing, has been just riddled with backlash and so much criticism towards our two lead actresses in this film, Rachel Zegler and Gal Gadot. Gal Gadot, because she's mentioned things in terms of Israel and the Palestine situation online. She's been in support of a lot of things with Israel, which has definitely riled up a lot of feathers in the political space, and of course, and just with everything going on, there's a lot of dark stuff going on that side of the world, and she's had a lot to say on that, and so there's a lot of criticism there. And then Rachel Zegler, early on, before the film was even really heavily into production, had a lot to say about the original film, made some commentary about how they were going to modernize the new film and try to make it like a female empowerment film in comparison to the original one. And it felt very much like she was talking down on that original 1937 film, which of course put a lot of people off who are huge fans of that original film. And so it's been just riddled with all sorts of "I want this film to fail" before even coming out. There's been so many people online already review bombing websites like IMDb and Letterboxd and other sites just to see this movie fail. Anytime I go into the comment section for this movie in any way, shape, or form, it's just making fun of Rachel Zegler, talking down on Gal Gadot, and talking down on this film in general. People want to see this film fail. But I got the chance to check it out a little bit early, and I'm the kind of person who can easily separate art from artist. So before we get into my thoughts on the film, let's get into what this version of Snow White is all about. This iteration of Snow White is very familiar to the version you know of before, but this time around we see Snow White played by Rachel Zegler, as she is a princess turned servant girl after the evil queen has taken over the kingdom and made it so that nobody knows who Snow White is. But of course, like the original tale, once she asks her magic mirror on the wall who's the fairest of them all and finds out that it's Snow White, she does what she can to try to kill Snow White. But of course, this leads to Snow White running off into the forest and meeting a group of 7 dwarves, of course known as Dopey, Bashful, Grumpy, Doc, Happy, Sleepy, and Sneezy. And of course, over the course of the film, she ends up building a bond with them. And of course, that evil queen will try to come back for Snow White once again later on in the film. And it's the basic gist of what you know the original story to be. What I'll start this off by saying, and some people immediately are probably going to be like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, I don't want to hear anything he has to say, but I like to keep myself honest here, is I actually enjoyed this film. Now, I do have some gripes, and we're going to get into that. By no means do I think this is a perfect film, but in a lot of ways, as somebody who's enjoyed a lot of the Disney live-action remakes, but recently I've been a little bit hit or miss with a lot of them, I'm happy to say that this film, I think, is really solid in a lot of places. When the film started to premiere, and there was some early critics that got to check it out, I was actually quite surprised to see that the buzz online was that the film is actually a lot better than people are giving it credit for, and it's a lot better than I think a lot of people are expecting it to be. And now, having just seen the film, I sat outside of the theater talking to my family who joined me, as well as my buddy, the Big Rob Theory, who also saw the film with us. And we all kind of unanimously were like, that was fun. That was a cute, fun time. I think it's something that's going to be very harmless for parents to take their kids to see it. And I think a lot of people who are big fans of the original film are going to be able to enjoy a lot about this film. I think this film, in a lot of ways, does a good job of honoring the original film, but doing enough different for this film to really warrant the existence of a remake. I've always been of the mindset that if you're gonna make a remake of a classically beloved film, then you gotta do something different. You gotta give this iteration its own life to some extent while still honoring what came before, because if you don't give something new to the audience, then what's the point of doing the remake at all? And a lot of films have been criticized for that. I really enjoyed the live action Lion King movie, though it's not anywhere near as good as the original film, but you know, that movie was heavily criticized for being too close to the source material and just not having as much soul. And I think when it comes down to the the original 1937 film of Snow White, which I did cover here on the channel this past week. If you saw my review, you'll know that I said it's such a fun and charming film to watch, incredibly cute, and I enjoyed all the characters in it, but it's a paper-thin story. There's not an abundance to it. The beginning kind of takes off pretty quickly. The middle section, which is just Snow White and the 7 dwarves hanging out, is just, you know, fun, but doesn't really have meat on the bones in terms of narrative, and the movie wraps up really quickly. So I think Snow White actually was a great opportunity to be able to expand on a pretty straightforward, similar narrative. And I think in a lot of ways, this film takes that simple premise that you know and love, all those key moments for the most part are in this remake, while also being able to expand upon the characters, expand upon certain elements that definitely, you know, give this film in general a little bit more meat on the bones, especially when you look at the beginning and the end of this film. The bookends of this film definitely expand upon these characters, expands upon the stakes of what's going on, and allows you to feel for what's going on here, and doesn't rush past things a lot more like the original does. And don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of the original film, and I take into account that that film came out in 1937 and was the very first Disney animated film of all time and the very first animated film of all time. So without a doubt, I have a lot of respect for that original film, but it is a simple film narratively. There isn't an abundance of meat on the bone, and I think that this film definitely elevated the material in terms of really expanding upon these characters. Let's start with the one that everybody is really having a lot of gripes with this film, which is Rachel Zegler as Snow White. Now, immediately, this is not somebody I would have cast in this role just based on the look of Snow White. Of course, you know, skin as white as snow is kind of the thing here. They kind of alter the approach here in terms of where her name comes from, so you're able to kind of buy into it a little bit more. But despite the fact that she wasn't necessarily somebody I would have gone for initially, and despite the PR stuff with the interviews that kind of rub people the wrong way, I actually think she did a really good job here. I knew that she was going to give us a great vocal performance. I really enjoyed her in things like West Side Story or things like that last Hunger Games film that came out as well. I think she's a very talented actress who has a very great voice, and I think she fit the role of Snow White really well as time went on. As the movie was playing out, I found myself more and more into her character. Again, I don't necessarily know that she's who I would have cast in the role, and I don't necessarily know that the classic Snow White bob haircut really works for her, but I think for the most part, she really sells the performance. She does a good job to lean into it. She's believable as the character, and as the runtime played out, I found myself more and more engaged in her iteration of Snow White, which very much feels like her iteration. And again, I am very much of the mindset that if you're going to do a remake, you got to make it feel like it's got its own energy to it. It's got to have its own life. If not, it just feels like a cheaper version of what's come before. Now, one element that I think was a little bit paper thin in this film in comparison to the other things that were expanded is the evil queen that's played by Gal Gadot. Now, I think Gal Gadot is a beautiful actress. I really enjoyed her in the film in a lot of ways. I thought she had the look of the evil queen, but I do think her character is one of the only characters of the returning characters in this film that isn't really given as much meat on the bone. She is a pretty one-note villain throughout the course of the film. She has some nice scenery in the film in terms of the locations that are used with her. I think the costume design, the makeup, and the set design around her is really cool. There is an interesting musical number around her that I'm not really sure Gal Gadot really sang entirely herself. Maybe she did. I don't know. At times it felt like maybe they had a voice double for some of the sequences of vocal performance from her. But, you know, for the most part, I thought she fit the role well, but I don't really know that this film does much to really elevate her beyond what you know the evil queen to be from before. Whereas I think like Rachel Zegler as Snow White on the page was really added in terms of narrative. They gave her more narrative depth. They gave her more to do. In the original film, she's a little bit more straightforward, a very naive, sweet character that gets herself into trouble a lot of times because she is so kind of naive. And while there is still that touch of that here with this new Snow White, they give her a lot more narrative depth that allowed her to be a character you can root for a little bit more in some of these sequences compared to the evil queen that is pretty one note in this film still. Now, one element that is absolutely one note in the original film is the prince, who appears at the very beginning of the film and is enamored by Snow White immediately, only to be completely gone for the rest of the film and reappears at the very end of the film to, of course, classically kiss Snow White back to life, and then they just kind of stroll off into the sunset. He's a really one-note character, doesn't even have a name. There's not much to him in any way, shape, or form. This time around, the love interest has been reworked into to a character named Jonathan, who is a bandit, who is, out in the woods, who's stealing from the kingdom. He's not a prince, but he's given more sequences throughout the course of the film to really expand upon his relationship with Snow White, to really believe in their romance. And that was one thing I think actually expanded upon and was maybe better than what the original did. I think some people are going to want him to be a prince in this film, but I think that we're kind of retooling him to be a character that has something that's a little bit more in common with Snow White in this film, I thought was an interesting approach, and I think ultimately allowed him to be a far more likable character that allowed a lot of these sequences between him and Rachel Zegler to really sell you on these characters and their romance, instead of him just being this prince who shows up at the beginning and shows up at the end and just kind of rolls off into the sunset. Ultimately, that wouldn't have worked for modern day audiences, and I think that was one area where this film modernized it and definitely brought it to the modern day in a way that very much worked and felt like a lot more contemporary, and felt like it really fleshed things out a little bit better. And of course, you have the 7 dwarves, who I think were all great in this film. Now, before the film came out, there was reports online that it wasn't going to be Snow White and the 7 dwarves, but that instead it was going to be Snow White and her random assortment of friends. And there was an image that came out online of these individuals, and that, a lot of people were calling the film woke and saying that this was just going to be absolute trash and that they weren't doing the 7 dwarves. Now, I don't know if that was false reporting or if that was just, maybe something that they reworked after the reaction online. But of course, the 7 dwarves are in this film, and those characters, though, that were in those shots that released that people say were supposed to be the 7 dwarves kind of replaced, those individuals are in the film as different characters. I won't say too much about that, but they are in the film, so I don't know if that was a rework or just false marketing in terms of people that, saw those images and kind of started to create their own conversation around it. But as far as the 7 dwarves, there's been a lot of discourse online on whether or not they should have cast actual little actors, little people actors who have, that condition to be smaller and actually play those roles, or if they should have done what they did in the film, which was the CGI versions. And I'm of two minds on it. I think they easily could have cast a lot of actors who, of course, are little people and could have fit those roles very well. But I think on another hand, with the film being very vibrant and colorful with a lot of CGI, especially with the animals, and it being this mystical forest that they're in, I think that the 7 dwarves actually worked a lot for me in this film. It's a little bit uncanny valley when you first see them, but I think for the most part, it really worked. I enjoyed the look of the characters. It's very true to the iterations from the original animated film, which made them feel like fun live action cartoon characters alongside the various animals we see in the rest of the film. And I think when it comes down to the visuals of the film in general, I think the CGI very much fits the tone of the film. I've said it here on the channel many times before, but I'm very much an advocate for CGI that fits the tone of the film. And if it's a film that's lighthearted and a little bit more cartoony, I can definitely forgive CGI that isn't going for realism, and I don't think that that's what Snow White was going for. Outside of that, I think the production value and production design in general of the film is pretty solid. The costume design is pretty solid. There is some green screen at times that is pretty noticeable, but outside of that, I think the overall look of the film, the makeup that these characters have, the costume design, the locations they're in, all of that I think is really solid throughout the course of the film. And so similarly, as the movie was playing out, I found myself more and more endeared to these iterations of the 7 dwarves that in a lot of ways feel like proper, remake versions of the characters from the original film. The only one that I was a little kind of iffy on is Dopey, who at times I really loved, but I don't think they made him as dopey as he was in the original film, maybe to not offend people and kind of make him feel like a character with special needs too much. I don't really know, but they do some things with his character that feel very not as faithful to the original film. But with all that said, I did enjoy the film, but let's lean into some of my negatives really quickly, which is that while I do think this film expands on a lot of things and really does kind of elevate the material and makes this paper thin narrative of Snow White a little bit more expanded in this film, there are areas where I feel like they, could have done something differently. There, like I mentioned before, I think that the evil queen is pretty one note throughout the course of the film, and I don't think Gal Gadot is given too much to do on the page in terms of the script. I do think also there are a couple of side characters in the film that felt very inconsequential. I think the finale of the film at times felt a little bit underwhelming. There's a handful of brand new songs that are added to the film that I wasn't crazy about, though there are some new songs in the film I enjoyed as well, like Waiting on a Wish, which is the main one that's been marketed ahead of this film. But yeah, there were a couple of things here and there that I wasn't crazy about. Not every song hit with me. Not every new story beat kind of worked for me. There was a couple of things that just felt very convenient and kind of like they breezed over certain things. And I was really sad to see certain songs omitted from this version, like Waiting for My Prince to Come, that classic song. I think that's what it's called. But the classic song that Snow White sings to the dwarves when they're in their cottage. And I know that it's because the main character, Jonathan, is not a prince this time around. Maybe that song just wouldn't have worked in the film, but it was sad to see a very classic Snow White song not be in this film. With all that said, though, I do think that Snow White is a lot better than a lot of people are going to give it credit for. I think there's going to be a percentage of the audience that are going to go into this film thinking it's going to be terrible, thinking that it's trash already, that hate Rachel Zegler, that hate Gal Gadot. If you go to any movie review rating site, you'll already see a monsoon of reviews for people who have clearly not seen the film that are very much being very biased about their opinions about the people in the film. As somebody who can separate myself from art and artist, I genuinely found this to be a cute, fun time that I think is going to be harmless for kids. I think if you're a parent and you're looking for something to take your kids to go watch in theaters, there's definitely something enjoyable here. I think it's something that longtime Disney fans as well are going to feel nostalgic for, despite the little changes here and there. I do think this is a film that elevates the material, does enough different to not feel just like a copy and paste remake, while also, you know, having a couple things I wasn't crazy about. For the most part, I think this is a pretty harmless watch, not nearly as offensively bad as I think people are trying to make it out to be, but it isn't incredible either. I think there's areas that could have been better, but I ultimately found myself having a good time with the film. I was locked in as the movie was playing out. I was never bored while watching it, and as soon as the movie was over, I went, hey, that was pretty cute. That was a good time. I can see myself revisiting this film in the future and maybe enjoying it more than I did this time around. So that's going to be my thoughts on Snow White. Definitely looking forward to hearing all of your guys' opinions. I'm sure there'll be some people down in the comments that want to call me a shill and say that I don't know what I'm talking about because I enjoyed this film, but that's okay with me. If you guys enjoyed the film as well, though, whenever the film does come out in your area, leave some comments down below. Did you like the film? Did you not like the film? If you haven't seen it, are you planning on checking it out? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.